Hi, welcome to EPG Pathshala. We are now going to look at a module on mental health and human rights as part of a paper on mental health. I'm Shubhada Maitra. I teach with the Center for Health and Mental Health in the School of Social Work. I'm a professor there. The discourse around human rights of persons living with mental disorders in India can be traced to the early 70s, when several instances of inhuman conditions of the mental hospitals were pointed out through journalistic writings and public interest litigations. One of the first cases that was quite prominent at that time was that of Shahadra Mental Hospital, which is now known as the Institute of Behavioral Health and Allied Sciences in New Delhi. So the Supreme Court passed judgments about improving conditions and facilities within the hospital. But what happened was, even through those judgments, the changes that happened were limited to specific hospitals which were litigated against or which were written about in the journalistic report. Large-scale changes in the mental health treatment, care and rehabilitation system were really slow to come by. Over the years, the discourse around human rights in the field of mental health has really grown louder to go beyond long-stay patients in mental hospitals to encompass mental health rights of women, children and sexual minorities. The objectives of this particular module is to develop clarity around key concepts such as mental health problems, mental disorders, psychosocial disability and human rights, to develop knowledge about national and international instruments and principles of human rights, to develop an ability to identify human rights violations in the field of mental health, and to develop appreciation of the scope of application of human rights principles in practice. So let's begin by looking at key concepts. Mental health problems, psychosocial disability and mental disorders are terms that are commonly used in association with each other, sometimes used interchangeably. However, these are distinct and denote different emotional and psychosocial states. Let's look at mental health. Let's look at mental health as a concept. WHO defines mental health as a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the daily stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. Inherent in this definition are aspects that relate to an internal state and an external functioning. So what is internal state? The ability to develop and realize one's own potential, the ability to cope with stresses of everyday life. These are internal states. External functioning is the ability to work and function and contribute meaningfully to society. Mental health is a dynamic, fluctuating, changing state. It's not an ideal state that can ever be achieved. And it's dynamic and fluctuating based on external stimuli and our responses to those stimuli. Also remember, mental health varies across cultures, time and space. What is considered well-being in one culture at a particular time may be quite different for another cultural group at the same time, or within cultures at different periods of time. For example, what is diagnosed as dissociative or conversion disorder in many Western cultures is popularly known as possession in several Eastern societies. And people who get possessed, particularly possessed by gods, are often worshipped and given a higher status in the household, but also within the community and society. Let's turn to mental health problems. We are all familiar with what mental health problems are. Well, let me tell you, mental health problems are not the same as mental disorders. Mental health problems are largely everyday stress, upset, strain, distress, about issues that may seem out of one's control. They include a large array of conditions that need not be diagnosed or diagnosable. Depending on the nature and severity of the distress or upset experienced, some areas of functioning may temporarily be impaired, and for that we need a little hand-holding. So when someone is experiencing mental health problems, a little hand-holding, a little counseling gets the person right on track. A person, for example, caught in an unexpected situation may not be able to focus and make decisions that he or she is usually capable of, and that's when I said a little hand holding and timely help helps, so that these patterns are not converted into maladaptive patterns in the long term. What are mental disorders? These are also referred to as mental illness or psychiatric disorders. This is a mental disorder is a condition diagnosed by a psychiatrist and which is characterized by disturbances in thoughts, behaviors, sensing, reasoning and feelings. Because they are poorly understood and steeped in myths and misconceptions, they can cause much suffering and disruption in several areas of functioning. Emic perspectives or insider knowledge through the user-survivor movement abroad as well as in India have enhanced our understanding of the conditions diagnosed by medical professionals and, more importantly, living meaningfully with such a condition. So mental disorder is more than a diagnosed condition. It is the experience of living with a label that sticks to you for almost a lifetime. Psychosocial disability. Psychosocial disability is an internationally recognized term. In fact, it is replacing mental disorders as a term. This is an internationally recognized term under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or the UNCRPD, which I will refer to in short from here on. Used to describe, so psychosocial disabilities are really is a term that is used to describe the experience of people with impairments and participation restrictions related to mental health conditions. It goes beyond the medical term mental disorders that pathologizes distressful experiences resulting in marginalization and exclusion. So psychosocial disability really takes into consideration issues of marginalization and exclusion. It encompasses both the experience of illness as well as the long-term psychosocial outcomes which limit participation in various spheres of life to attain optimum well-being. Mental health and human rights groups prefer to use the term psychosocial disability rather than mental disorder to locate experiences within the human rights and recovery discourse rather than the biomedical paradigm. What are human rights? This is our next concept. Human rights are rights and freedoms that belong to all people equally, irrespective of who you are, irrespective of your caste, creed, religion, political affiliation. Human rights of each individual without discrimination encompass both civil and political rights as well as economic, social and cultural rights. Human rights are universal. That means they apply to everyone regardless of caste, class, gender, age, sexual orientation, language, religion or disability, including mental health problems or other differences. The universality of human rights was first emphasized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 and has been adopted by most states the world over. Human rights are inherent, that they apply to each person by virtue of being human. Human rights are inalienable. No one can give up their human rights, and others may only interfere with our human rights in certain cases. For example, one's right to liberty may be restricted if the person is found guilty of a crime by a court of law. Human rights are interdependent and indivisible. Each right is dependent on another right, and often one human right is needed to enjoy another. For example, civil and political rights such as right to life, freedom of expression and equality before the law, and social and economic rights such as right to education, right to work, are interrelated, indivisible and interdependent. The enhancement of one right leads to advancement of other rights. Similarly, if one right is taken away, it affects the enjoyment of other rights and fundamental freedoms. What are some of the principles or instruments that protect human rights? Our Indian Constitution, in Part 3 of the Constitution, the protection of fundamental rights is guaranteed, and these are the right to equality, the right to freedom, the right against exploitation, the right to freedom of religion, cultural and educational rights, and right to constitutional remedies. The other instrument is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I referred to earlier. This is a milestone document in the history of human rights, adopted by the UN General Assembly in Paris on December 10, 1948. It set out for the first time fundamental human rights to be universally protected. Some of the UN human rights treaties that India has ratified include the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Besides the above-mentioned treaties, the UN in 1991 also adopted the principles on the protection of persons with mental illness and improvement of mental health care. So the UNCRPD came into force in 2008 to promote, protect and ensure the human rights of persons with disabilities, including those with psychosocial disabilities. The UNCRPD recognizes that disability is an evolving concept and that disability results from the interaction between persons with impairments and attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinders full and effective participation in society. So it is the discrimination from society that actually inhibits and hinders and interferes with full participation, full and effective participation of people with psychosocial disabilities in society. The UNCRPD recognizes the autonomy and independence of persons with disabilities and emphasizes that they have a right and freedom to make their own choices or be supported to make decisions that are in their best interest. The Convention recognizes the increased risk and vulnerability of women and girls with disabilities to violence, abuse, neglect, and exploitation, and urges the adoption of a gender perspective in programming and policy making. Some of the principles that the UNCRPD is based on are respect for inherent dignity, individual autonomy, including the freedom to make one's own choices and independence of others, non-discrimination, full and effective participation and inclusion in society, respect for difference and acceptance of persons with disabilities as part of human diversity and humanity, equality of opportunity, accessibility, equality between men and women, respect for the evolving capacities of children with disabilities, and respect for the right of children with disabilities to preserve their identities. For the first time, the UNCRPD has actually talked about legal capacity, because for so long the right to make choice and to make decisions by a person with a mental disorder were no longer his or hers. But the UNCRPD stresses that people with psychosocial disabilities have legal capacity and they must be allowed to make choices and decisions, and in the event when they are not, when it is not possible for them to make these choices and decisions, they should be supported so that all decisions and choices are taken in their best interest. Let's move to the principles on the protection of persons with mental illness and improvement of mental health care. These are the MI principles 1991 as they are known. This is a set of 25 principles which highlight the rights of persons with mental illness, as well as standards of care and treatment. So it's talking about individual rights, but also state responsibility in terms of how these rights are to be guaranteed through appropriate treatment, care and rehabilitation of facilities and services, mental health services. These range from, the 25 principles range from fundamental freedoms and basic rights to confidentiality. So some of these include consent to treatment, including freedom from coercive measures such as participation in clinical trials, psychosurgeries and other irreversible procedures. You are probably familiar with, many years ago, a home in Pune where mentally challenged girls were lodged. Young girls below the age of 20 were lined up for hysterectomies. They were lined up for hysterectomies because they were getting pregnant. Why is there pregnancy in a state-run home among women who are mentally challenged? Who has access to these women? And how do we, so by doing hysterectomies, are we protecting the women or are we protecting the abusers? Now, consent to treatment means that the person with a psychosocial disability is able to consent to some of these procedures, and no one would ever consent to these procedures. So the MI principle really talks about no coercion. That consent doesn't mean saying yes or no, but it also means that it happens in an environment where there is no coercion, no force. It also talks about treatment that upholds the dignity of persons and treatments that are least restrictive. Again, in Irwadi in 1981, we note in 2001 we saw that about 28 people who were chained to their beds in a dargah, which was a faith healing facility, were charred to death because a fire broke out in the facility. Now, what is least restrictive treatment? You don't chain human beings. Of course, you need to take care of them. They may run away. You need to protect them. But what are the measures in which all of this can be facilitated without getting into inhuman practices like chaining or confining? So the principles, the UN principles really talk about some of these, and how should treatment facilities actually treat people with dignity and respect. It also talks about standard of care and individualized care plans, that you are not running a cookie cutting machine, or you are not looking at an assembly line production, that all patients do not have the same treatment needs, and that each patient's treatment, care, rehabilitation, recovery needs to be planned in an individualized manner, taking into consideration not only the diagnosis, but also the kind of traumas that the patient has brought in with him or her that has led to the mental disorder in the first place. The UN principles talk about care in the community, that all care for mental disorders need not be organized in a tertiary facility like a mental hospital, but it can be and it should be facilitated within the community. It talks about non-discrimination on the basis of psychosocial disability, that you cannot discriminate against a person with psychosocial disability or mental disorder just because he or she has a mental disorder. It talks about inclusion in community life and participation. It also talks about issues of mental health care, such as facilities within the institution. What are the kind of facilities that should be available, the minimum standard of care that should be available to people who are seeking mental health services within institutions. It focuses on admission process, appointment of a review body, access to information, and a set of principles that deals with criminal offenders with mental health problems. In fact, the UN principles of 1991 state that admissions should be, as far as possible, voluntary admissions. And this is reiterated by the more recent Mental Health Care Bill of 2016. The bill was passed by the Rajya Sabha on 8th of August 2016. The preamble or the bill states, to provide for mental health care and services for persons with mental illness, and to protect, promote, fulfill the rights of such persons during delivery of mental health care and services, and for matters connected herewith or incidental thereto, and recognizes the need to align and harmonize the existing laws with the UNCRPD. So note the language of included in the preamble. It talks about protection, promotion and fulfillment of rights of persons. What do these things mean? To protect means that the state must actively do some things that will help you and help others not to take away your human rights. To promote is again to do some things that help you to realize your human rights, and to respect or fulfill are the negative duties of the state, that the state cannot do anything that will take away your rights. So the state, for example, cannot take away your livelihood for the purposes of development, for example, because if that is so, you are deprived of your right to livelihood. Okay, but look at this language: to protect, promote, fulfill the rights of persons, and we are talking about services. This is perhaps for the first time in the history of India that we have an official bill that is passed by the Rajya Sabha that is talking about the rights of people with mental disorders. And I think this is a landmark that at least the discourse, a formal, while the discourse around mental health and human rights dates back to at least 4 or 5 decades, a formal discourse around human rights has really started more recently. And I would say it is important to uphold some of the principles that the mental health care bill states and talks about. So for example, the mental health care bill is comprised of 16 chapters. Chapter 2 is devoted to rights. It recognizes the legal capacity, like is said in the preamble, that we need to harmonize our laws with the UNCRPD, which the state has ratified. The bill recognizes the legal capacity of persons with mental illness to make mental health care and treatment related decisions. Chapter 5 details the rights of persons with mental illness, emphasizing on the following rights: the right to access mental health care, the right to community living, the right to protection from cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment. And if you were to visit a mental hospital, you would know what is meant by cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment. But tying up in chains, calling names and abuses, being in a locked facility is all degrading and very restrictive. The right to information, the right to confidentiality, restriction on release of information in respect of mental illness. It talks about the right to access medical records, the right to personal contacts and communication while you are accessing services, the right to legal aid, and the right to make complaints about deficiencies in the provision of services. Chapter 12 details admission procedures to a mental health facility. So remember what we said about the UN principles of 1991 and admission procedures, and how many admissions should be voluntary. So the bill of 2016 also states that most admissions be independent admissions, referring to the legal capacity of the person with mental illness, again going back and harmonizing with the UNCRPD. In situations where this is not possible, where independent admissions are not possible, the bill suggests supported admissions by a nominated representative of the person with mental illness, and that such admission should be restricted to a period of 30 days, that at the end of 30 days these should be reviewed. So we have several legislations and principles and instruments that protect the human rights of persons with mental disorder. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a story about my own professional experience, and I want all of you to think about some of the questions that I'm going to pose at the end of the story. So this is a project called Tarasha, a field action project of Tata Institute of Social Sciences. The project is a recovery project, a community-based recovery project working with women living with mental disorders. The project links psychosocial issues, livelihoods and shelter to reintegrate and facilitate recovery of women living with mental disorders. So we are looking at reintegration into mainstream society. When we started the project in 2011, we went to the state government to seek discharge of adult women who were asymptomatic. We said to the then Directorate of Health Services that these are all adult women, they are currently asymptomatic, so they need to be discharged. And then they will join our project, and we will work with them through our 3 cornerstones to facilitate recovery and reintegration. And the state government told us that no, they have no guardians, they have no family, these are all abandoned women in the mental hospital, and if we have to discharge them, we can only discharge them to a guardian, so you take guardianship. And I said, no, we are a project and we will not take guardianship. The women will ask for discharge. What were we doing when we were seeking this discharge in 2011? We were really looking at legal capacity and self-determination of women who were in their own senses, who were currently asymptomatic, didn't have symptoms of mental disorders, and who could seek discharge. These are adult women. In no other health condition do I need another adult to ask something for me. I can go seek treatment, and I can say, well, I want discharge from the hospital, and I can get out. But in mental illness, this discharge hitherto was not allowed. So it was for the first time that we facilitated discharge of women. The story continues. Over a period of time, we have worked with several women. One of the women who worked with us for about a year began relapsing. She began having symptoms of bipolar disorder. On a couple of occasions, she was found by the city police on the streets at 2 o'clock in the morning. On one occasion, she was drunk. They called us up. They asked us to take her back. We realized she was staying in a hostel. So all our women stay in a hostel, a working women's hostel. They don't stay in stigmatized spaces. We realized staying in the hostel was not conducive for her safety. We wanted her to be monitored. We wanted her treatment to be monitored. We talked to her about it, and she agreed that she was not taking medication regularly, and that she needed to. So we agreed between the two of us, between the project and the woman, that she will be readmitted to the mental hospital. Now, because we had sought discharge, we had to go through a court procedure to seek readmission. We went through the court procedure, and this was a young 28-year-old girl, young, highly qualified, English-speaking girl. So when she represented herself in the court, the magistrate court, the magistrate would not allow us to readmit her to the hospital. He said, well, she is speaking good English, she is educated, she is in her senses. And I kept telling him what the disorder of bipolar disorder, what it is like, that it impairs judgment. She is putting herself to risk. And we cannot. On 2 occasions, the Bandra police found her and they took her into custody and phoned us. On another occasion, she could be found dead. And we said she has agreed to treatment. So there are no other facilities in Bombay where we can monitor her treatment without an attendant. And as a project, we don't have a 24-hour attendant to be with her, which is a requirement of many municipal hospitals. Finally, the magistrate was willing to pass an order for readmission. And he told me, he said, okay, you file a petition. And I looked at this girl who was standing across me. And when I looked at her, she had tears in her eyes. And she said to me, I will not go inside. Means I will not go back to the hospital. I looked at the magistrate and I said, I'm not filing the petition for readmission. And the magistrate thought I was crazy. He really thought that a woman who was fighting for 4 days, sweating it out in the magistrate's court, trying to tell him what the disorder is like, how she is impaired in her judgment, how she is putting her life at risk, when he allows me to file a petition and is willing to pass an order for readmission just on her word, when she said, I won't go inside, I said, I won't file the petition. And she didn't go inside. We were again upholding self-determination. But more importantly, we were upholding legal capacity. What else were we doing? We were saying we can care for this woman in the community. We don't need to go to the hospital. It was a big risk we were taking by keeping her in the same hostel where she was jeopardizing not only her own life, but also the safety of other girls. So we had to move her out to another hostel. And we had to work very closely with her. But in conclusion, what I would like to tell you through this story is two things. One is, it is not easy to uphold human rights of people, particularly with psychosocial disabilities. It is not easy to realize their human rights and help them realize their human rights against all odds. You are really fighting odds. You're fighting, looking at safety. So who are you? Are you there to protect? And why should you protect? These are all adults. And we have to help them protect themselves. So treading the path of human rights in the field of mental health and psychosocial disability is hard, but it is not impossible. That's one thing. Two is, let us begin to scrutinize, put to scrutiny our own practice. Why did the judge initially not pass the order for readmission? Was it because of the young girl's qualification, English speaking capacity? Would another person from a different background, not so educated, perhaps not speaking English, would I have received an order on the first day itself to readmit such a person? So what is it about, are we still discriminating? And in what ways are we discriminating? Whether it is through our judgments or non-judgments and our practice. The other is the power and the hierarchy. When she looked at me and said, I won't go in, I had tremendous power. As project director, I was in a position to readmit her in her best interest. And yet, I was not there to decide her best interest. She was there, she needed support for her treatment. And as an organization, we said we need to give her that support and not readmit her to a mental hospital if she didn't want to, no matter whether she was posing a risk to her life. After all, it was her life. What we need to do is to tell her what the risks are, and she takes decisions and bears responsibility and the consequences of those decisions. But we are there to support her. Thank you so much.